Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. And on this Wednesday evening, I'm joined by wandering internationalist David Adler. David, how are you doing?
I'm so great. It's so nice to be back on the program. I think that today we'll speak about the great unfolding of the United States of America, which is a tremendous spectacle to watch from outside the country and a tremendous tragedy for my people back at home. So thank you for having me here as an ambassador of this fading empire.
Solidarity to your people at home, David. Coming up, or some of them, I suppose, not all of them. Coming up tonight, Trump's speech to Congress, as you've just mentioned there. An interview with millionaire Dale Vince on why he wants to pay more tax, and a bust-up between Ed Balls and James Schneider on Good Morning Britain. Following on from their bust-up in the White House on Friday. Yesterday, Trump cut off military support for Ukraine, and that's now been extended or expanded to include all military intelligence. This was from Sky News just a couple of hours ago. They say the US has stopped sharing all intelligence with Kyiv. That's from a Ukrainian source. Previously, the source with knowledge of the situation said the halt in the flow of intelligence had been selective, only affecting information that could be used for attacks inside Russia. A few hours ago, the exchange of all information was stopped, the source said. That is likely to severely limit Ukraine's ability to defend its territory against Russia, and it comes only a day after Trump had seemed to suggest a thawing in the relationship between him and the Ukrainian president.
Earlier today, I received an important letter from President Zelensky of Ukraine. The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time that is convenient for you. I appreciate that he sent this letter, just got it a little while ago. Simultaneously, we've had serious discussions with Russia and have received strong signals that they are ready for peace. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Wouldn't that be beautiful?
Donald Trump is in a rush for a peace deal, seemingly on any terms, which was perhaps the thinking behind cutting off Ukraine's intelligence. And today, CIA Director John Ratcliffe suggested that with Ukraine now expressing support for talks, military aid and intelligence support for the country could at some point be restarted. He said this to Fox News.
What President Trump said is he asked for a pause. As I've mentioned, President Trump is the peace president. Never been a war under his leadership. He wants to end the wars that exist. And so in this case, as everyone saw play out, President Trump had a real question about whether President Zelensky was committed to the peace process. And he said, let's pause. I want to give you a chance to think about that. And you saw the response that President Zelensky put out a statement saying, I'm ready for peace. And I want Donald Trump's leadership to bring about that peace. And so I think on the military front and the intelligence front, the pause that allowed that to happen, I think will go away. And I think we'll work shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine as we have to push back on the aggression that's there, but to put the world in a better place for these peace negotiations to move forward.
Earlier today, I spoke to Volodymyr Dubovyk, Professor of International Relations at the University of Odessa, Ukraine. He was speaking to me from Berlin. And I began by asking about the significance of the US withdrawing military and intelligence support for Ukraine.
Well, it's significant. It's significant, of course, in terms of Ukraine's military forces, armed forces' ability to fight the war. That's one thing. Already our commanders reporting that they are being not shared that intelligence which is needed for some strikes, longer range strikes against Russia's military targets. It's significant politically as well, because it really is a part of the current approach of Trump administration of breaking Ukraine, to the extent that Zelensky and Ukrainian leaders would say, yes, we're ready to sign whatever you want from us, because you should add the suspension of military aid to it. You should have add a recent, a meeting in the White House. You should add U.S. pushing Ukraine to sign the rare earths minerals deal, which is not in Ukraine's interest really. And the whole approach in that deal is purely unpleasant, I should say, imperialistic and neo-colonial kind of a little bit touch, the way U.S. is treating on that particular deal, Ukraine. So unfortunately, we're seeing illustrations and more proof, that evidence that Trump has decided that he wants an opening with Russia, some kind of grand bargain, which he wanted, by the way, badly back when he was president first time around, except that he wasn't able to do it then. But now he wants to do it. And Ukraine's security in future is just not significant. It's not something which registers with him too much. It's much easier to get to the deal, which would be enabling Trump to say, look, I'm the greatest politician that ever lived. Give me the Nobel Peace Prize already. And to push Ukraine and squeeze Ukraine instead of Russia. Because we're not hearing about any concessions or compromises from Kremlin whatsoever. On the contrary, actually, I'm afraid that Moscow will come up with more and more conditions and demands, actually, which might, by the way, if they're greedy too much, the Russians, might actually unravel a little bit the Trump to sign some kind of ceasefire if they put too many demands on the table. But in the meantime, still, I think that Ukraine's interests are being sacrificed at the altar, of this priority of opening a strategic rapprochement, new reset with Russia.
I don't think any of our viewers would question the fact that Donald Trump doesn't seem to care about Ukrainians. I think that's clear for anyone who's watching. I suppose one response, though, Donald Trump wasn't really, as far as I understand, limiting sort of military support or intelligence support until that meeting last Friday. And in part, it seemed to be the case that sort of Donald Trump was willing to continue day-to-day support, but he didn't want to give Ukraine a security guarantee, saying this is a red line for the United States. We're not interested in being on the front line with Russia once this war is over. And Zelensky kept pushing on that issue. He kept bringing up the idea, no, we do need a US security guarantee. Do you think sort of tactically and even strategically, it might be time for Zelensky to give up on pushing for a US security guarantee, to accept that it's not coming and trying to get something else from the Americans? So I suppose military support while it's still available, maybe the promise of more military equipment after any ceasefire deal. Should he give up on the idea of Americans providing a backstop with their own troops were Russia to break any ceasefire deal in the future?
It wasn't that Americans decided to suspend military aid and sharing intelligence because of the meeting in the White House went wrong. It was on the contrary. It was maybe this ambush and the setup that Zelensky experienced in the Oval Office last Friday, that it was orchestrated in order to have a smokescreen and reason and rationale to show to everyone, including the MAGA crowds, and say, well, look, but Zelensky is not cooperating. He doesn't want peace. He's an obstacle on the path towards peace. So therefore, we need to do unpleasant things like suspending military aid and so on. But it's actually the part of what Trump wanted to do all along. Again, if you go back to that Friday evening, European time, but Friday in US, when Trump was leaving the White House and about to board the helicopter and go to Mar-a-Lago, he said as much that Zelensky first have to stop calling Putin a terrorist and killer. That's not helping in terms of reaching out for peace. But what else do you want the president of Ukraine, who suffered this terrible large-scale invasion for the last 3+ years, to call Putin? That's one thing. But most importantly, he said, Zelensky wants us to be on Ukraine's side, and we are not going to be on Ukraine's side. So basically, he's saying we're not going to give any weapons. If you say that Zelensky is an obstacle to peace, and they are neutral now, so they shouldn't send any weapons to Ukraine, therefore, right? That's a logic of the process. They shouldn't give Ukrainians intelligence information that Ukrainian military can use to continue hitting Russian targets. Moreover, Zelensky now in a tweet, yesterday's tweet, he says that we are ready for the partial ceasefire or truce, basically reflecting some of the ideas that were vented in a recent meeting in London. That you can actually do ceasefire at certain stages. So kind of trying to subscribe to that point of view. And in that respect, I don't know if you're going to ask it if we have time for that or not. The position and the role of Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, and some others is still large. It's a big role. I mean, because they need to create a blueprint, formulate a blueprint for the peace plan, because Americans don't have any peace plan really with Ukraine, reflecting Ukraine's interests, and then present it to Trump. I mean, it's unlikely that Trump would be happy with that blueprint, but at least there will be some alternative plan, that Europeans now, together with Ukraine, can be pushing, because it makes sense, because it's all about Ukraine's security and therefore European security. And Europeans now, and Brits, I mean, I kind of still include, I'm an old school guy, I kind of include Britain in Europe as well. But Europeans are really perplexed and worried about what they're seeing. There is a threat from Russia, and then there is a challenge or threat really from US. So you're kind of between the hammer and what's an expression, hammer and a hard place. Yeah, and that's a problem. And I think it gives a little bit of a room for maneuver to Zelensky, that Europe is kind of waking up and on his side, but not much. I mean, of course, militarily speaking, there are certain things that only Americans can give to us. But in terms of finances, in terms of maybe buying weapons elsewhere and giving it to Ukraine, Europe can do a lot, especially they dare to touch the frozen Russian assets. And the big question will be, by the way, going forward, if Trump would allow Europeans to buy weapons from US and give it to Ukraine. But we'll see. I mean, right now it looks like Trump is really set on this express course, towards signing something, anything, not really caring. Security guarantees, that's the only thing the Ukrainians are caring about. I mean, why would we need a ceasefire without anything attached to it? Of course we want to stop the war. Of course we want to stop, our cities being destroyed, like my hometown of Odessa, where I'm not at the moment, but it's been attacked several nights in a row again. With missiles and drones and everything. So we want to stop this, and our military stop being dying in the front line. But at what expense? Why did we fight for the 3 years now? For actually the Russian conditions being accepted by Washington as the only game in town? That's not what Ukraine needs. It's to us, what happens with the ceasefire, it all that matters. Security guarantees, financial and military aid, Ukraine's place at the table during negotiation about its own future. We don't want to be the object, and Zelensky actually done quite a good job recently, I think, in last few weeks, returning some agency to Ukraine, specifically on the rare earth minerals deal. When he said, this is not a deal which we will like, and I'm going to sign it right away without even looking into it, because we're not some kind of banana republic. So he stood his ground, and then he was punished by him being ambushed, and now punished and humiliated by all these recent signals that they're sending, including, by the way, the rumors that Trump administration is considering also doing away with some sanctions on Russia.
I suppose the issue is still, and where I'm sort of trying to work this out, is that the United States are saying, we're not going to give you a security guarantee. And Donald Trump is sort of now saying he's using this leverage to force Ukraine to agree to some kind of peace without a security guarantee. And Zelensky and yourself, you seem to be suggesting Ukraine won't agree to any kind of ceasefire without a security guarantee. And that does lead to a bit of an impasse, doesn't it? And I suppose what Donald Trump would say is, in an impasse, it's the Americans who have the cards. So what's the plan if Donald Trump doesn't budge, if he continues to say, I'm not going to give you a security guarantee, and because I don't believe that Ukraine is interested in peace without a security guarantee, I'm going to stop transporting weapons and sharing intelligence. What's the plan at that point?
A race against time, in the case of Ukraine, at least for sure, because how soon will Ukrainian military feel the lack of supply of US weapons? Maybe not that soon, because actually, after all, in the recent few months, there have been a lot of rushing of those weapons into Ukraine, because the Biden administration was trying to use the remaining money. They still haven't succeeded, because that's what we're talking about a little under $4 billion worth military weapons still not given to Ukraine. How soon will we see it? Will we deteriorate? Will the front line break, and unravel or not? What Europeans will do, they're able to give us more assistance and actually more weapons, and maybe find a way to maybe buy more weapons for Ukraine, including using this frozen assets, Russian frozen assets. So we'll see. That would really determine. But it's a competition of two strong wills. On the one hand, it's Trump with his ambitions and ego, and his vision and his disregard of Ukraine's future and Ukraine's interests. And on the other hand, it's Zelensky, who actually stands his ground, and not because that's his personal interest, but because he's really reflecting the thinking and the consensus within Ukrainian society. And that's why his ratings are now suddenly actually hiking, because Ukrainians see that he's standing up for Ukraine and Ukraine's future, and he wants to know what's going to happen to us, to our security going forward. And that's why he doesn't want to stop the dialogue. What would happen? There will be this continuous pressure on Ukraine to give up. Washington, unfortunately, will try to find a breaking point with Ukraine when there's just too much to bear. On the one hand, you have Russian troops continuing attacking Ukraine, and missiles flying, and drones and everything, and destructing energy infrastructure and attacking cities. On the other hand, you have this tremendous pressure from Washington. So the idea, I suppose, in expectation in Kremlin and hope in Kremlin, and the idea in Washington is that there will be too much to bear for Ukraine at one point, and Zelensky would say, okay, whatever. I mean, give us whatever document you want us to sign. We'll sign it because it's understood to us now. It's obvious to us that we cannot continue fighting in such circumstances when you're kind of fighting two superpowers at the same time.
Two issues I want to ask you about. So one, the 1 month truce suggested by France, and then second, the mineral rights deal that I know you've mentioned already. So should Zelensky sort of be considering saying, yeah, we're into this France 1 month truce, and should Zelensky sign the minerals deal with Donald Trump to try and sort of repair that relationship?
Well, let's fifth on the truce or a ceasefire, or the first stage of the ceasefire, or whatever you might want to call it. The logic is to see first what reaction there would be in Washington and in Moscow, because Moscow really wants to have an entire deal right away, and basically Ukraine's capitulation, Ukraine's surrender. So they might say, no, that's not good enough with us, especially if the part of the plan is, after all, to deploy some European peacekeepers in Ukraine when ceasefire is reached. Russia has said as much, that they don't want to see that happening. So they are really adamantly opposed to it. In Washington also, they might want to say, no, just a full ceasefire, no truce, no gradual truce and ceasefire, like Zelensky is suggesting now, being prodded on a queue from Paris, maybe in London. It remains to be seen if there is an agreement between those two on this. It seems to be more of a French idea. But so that's on the truce. We'll see. Right now, Zelensky already saying in that tweet that would be agreeable to Ukraine. On a deal about rare earth materials or minerals, natural resources of Ukraine, that deal, we don't need it really in Ukraine if you're Ukraine. I know that Zelensky suggested that himself, but he was trying to look at what might interest Trump many months ago in the light of Trump returning to the White House, maybe. That's when Zelensky said, okay, we have some natural resources that we can share or jointly explore or whatever. But what we received in the end was this kind of ultimatum, neo-colonialist imperialists, with the rights of extraterritoriality, even like, okay, the New York court would actually decide what happens. And of course, everyone in Ukraine was like, what? So in addition to Russia plundering Ukraine, you're not going to have US plundering Ukraine's resources. So what is in it for us? And therefore, Zelensky was really up in arms, and he said, no, that's not a good deal, really. Let's change a few things there first, including inserting the sentence on security guarantees. And Americans kind of agreed, and now they're disagreeing. We're hearing rumors again and information coming from Washington that Trump might perhaps said, no, we're not going to rush with signing that deal. So maybe we should press Ukraine to have a larger, bigger, better deal. So they might be empowered. That's what I'm afraid of, that if Ukraine shows too much of willingness to accommodate whatever demands Trump has, that would signal to Trump that Ukraine is ripe. It's cooked already. It's ready. It's broken. It's already an object. You can do whatever you like with it. So that's not good. in terms of Ukraine continuing to stand ground for its interests.
Members of the United States Congress, thank you very much. And to my fellow citizens, America is back.
Boy, it's embarrassing, isn't it? That was, of course, US President Donald Trump opening his big speech to Congress last night. It's kind of like a State of the Union, but because he's just been elected, it's not called a State of the Union. It's all quite technical. It was an hour and 40 minutes long. Very long. The man likes the sound of his own voice. They also paused for ages to do really long claps, so I can see how you might have written a speech that you thought would take 50 minutes and then it takes twice that. I'm always trying to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. Why is that? Much of the speech was devoted to bragging about how busy Trump has been in his first 6 weeks in office. He said, unusually, correctly, he wasn't actually lying this time, that he'd signed more executive orders than any other president. He said the president who was second was George Washington. Whether you think that's a good thing, of course, depends on whether or not you think climate change is bad or human rights are good. Elon Musk also got a shout out. He was in the gallery, so got his own round of applause. And Trump bragged about some of the projects that Doge had cut.
Just listen to some of the appalling waste we have already identified. $22 billion from HHS to provide free housing and cars for illegal aliens. $45 million for diversity, equity, and inclusion scholarships in Burma. $40 million to improve the social and economic inclusion of sedentary migrants. Nobody knows what that is. $8 million to promote LGBTQI+ in the African nation of Lesotho, which nobody has ever heard of. $60 million for indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian empowerment in Central America. $60 million. $8 million for making mice transgender. This is real. $32 million for a left-wing propaganda operation in Moldova. $10 million for male circumcision in Mozambique.
I don't know about the transgender mice. I don't know what he's talking about. Some people say it's maybe a deliberate slip up over the word transgenic, meaning the mice have had their DNA altered. But I suppose I could also see there might be some scientific value to bringing about transgender mice. And what you should know is that the figures here are very, very small. So if you're making a dent into the federal budget, these tiny amounts of money that have been given to scientific programs, they're not the issue. Also the case, circumcision actually is supposed to cut the rate of HIV transmission. So presumably that's why it was being promoted in that particular country. Trump has, of course, also cut a lot of vital medical research, which he was less inclined to brag about. We'll show you one more part of Trump's speech. He was speaking on the day that 25% tariffs came into effect on both Canada and Mexico. They, in turn, have implemented retaliatory tariffs. And now Trump seems to want to make this into a war.
April 2nd, reciprocal tariffs kick in. And whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal, back and forth. Whatever they tax us, we will tax them. If they do non-monetary tariffs to keep us out of their market, then we will do non-monetary barriers to keep them out of our market. There's a lot of that, too. They don't even allow us in their market. We will take in trillions and trillions of dollars and create jobs like we have never seen before. I did it with China and I did it with others, and the Biden administration couldn't do anything about it because there was so much money they couldn't do anything about it. We have been ripped off for decades by nearly every country on earth, and we will not let that happen any longer.
So as we were live, Trump has just posted an update on his own platform, Truth Social, where it says, Justin Trudeau of Canada called me to ask what could be done about tariffs. I told him that many people have died from fentanyl that came through the borders of Canada and Mexico, and nothing has convinced me that it has stopped. He said that it's gotten better, but I said that's not good enough. The call ended in a somewhat friendly manner. He was unable to tell me when the Canadian election is taking place, which made me curious, like, what's going on here? I then realized he is trying to use this issue to stay in power. Good luck, Justin. David, you are an American, usually based in Mexico City. Can you bring North America back together?
There's so many questions, as usual, that come from the kaleidoscopic speeches and foreign policy approaches that are hurled at the U.S. American public and the world at large from this. And one of the major questions that hangs over this State of the Union address in the Trump administration is the question of continuity and change. How much of a rupture from previous administrations does Trump 2.0 represent? I was recently on Novara FM and took some heat for taking the continuity side of things. I think that, when you speak about Trump setting a record for executive actions in the first weeks of this presidency, that is a remarkable new precedent. It's a remarkable new phenomenon, especially after 4 years of this impotent presidency in which the U.S. American public was reminded time and again how little could be done by the Biden administration, how little could be done by the Democratic Party to advance policies that would benefit people in terms of health or housing or education. And so seeing the Trump administration arrive with such ambition really does give a sense that this is a new era, a new style of policymaking, a new degree of preparation in the form of Project 2025 or elsewhere that is now being applied and implemented through this really heinous, ugly, clownish administration. On the other hand, I think it's worth noting, just for a point in the continuity column, that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump start their administrations with the same phrasing: America is back. Now, the latter may have a frankly more jingoistic tone than the former. I would argue both, though, are trying to articulate visions of U.S. American power, of its primacy and supremacy on the world stage. Joe Biden, as president, did not shy away from the application of U.S. unilateral and coercive power on the world stage in terms of punishing countries, close and far, allies and adversaries, whenever it deemed necessary through its control of the financial system and the SWIFT payment system, for example, suffocating countries like Cuba through really terroristic actions of unilateral coercive measures, or in its trade negotiations with other countries where issues like investor-state dispute settlement systems, international arbitration, these secret corporate courts where countries are taken to the cleaners for daring to raise minimum wages or protect the environment. This was something that Biden promised to eliminate from his international trade vision and then basically failed to do so. And we continued going on, basically bullying countries for attempts to recover their energy, food, or resource sovereignty. So there's a big debate that I'd love to hear from your listeners, from your viewers in the live chat and afterward about what we think in terms of continuity and change. Because what we're hearing in the annals of liberal media is a lot of hysterical screeching about this new era and what it means for U.S. American power. But we shouldn't forget these modes of continuity. We shouldn't forget the continuity between the CHIPS Act, which set out to cripple China's technological development, identified as a U.S. adversary, and Trump's new phase of a tariff war that he's escalating against Canada and Mexico. The question with tariffs of Canada and Mexico, and they've taken slightly different approaches, it bears repeating. Justin Trudeau has come out, and many of the other contenders in the Canadian election have come out with an iron fist, slamming it on the table, and basically saying, we're going to hit the U.S. where it hurts. We are a proud nation, and we're going to basically play the hardball against Donald Trump. It's not really clear that that's going to work with this administration. I think the Mexican approach has been much more cool-headed. Yesterday, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, who just on Monday reached historic, unprecedented levels of popularity, 85% popularity, surpassing the previous record set by her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, of 83%, took to her podium, to her daily Millionaire, her daily press conference that's beamed into the radios and televisions and homes of millions of Mexicans across the country, and basically said, we are a sovereign nation, we are an independent nation, we remain committed to cooperation with the United States, and called on Mexican citizens to join her in the Zócalo, in the central square of Mexico City, on Sunday for a mass mobilization, during which the government will announce the measures that it plans to take to protect its sovereignty and to respond to these unilateral and coercive measures from the United States. Now, what's interesting about that timeline looking towards Sunday is it gives Trump time also to reconsider what are, frankly, economically suicidal measures for the US-American economy. In the case of the car industry, for example, you've got parts that are traversing the North American borders once, twice, three times that will be hit extremely hard with these tariffs. And no one loves their cars like the Republican base that voted them into power. So it's not clear how sustainable this tariff war is in the North American context, with so much imbrication and interdependence between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And it's also, in violation of his own trade agreement. Trump recently celebrated in 2018, he renovated so-called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, into USMCA, and insisted on having US at the front of USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, as the free trade agreement that would govern the North American economy. And he celebrated it as the greatest trade agreement ever designed. That's the same agreement against which he's railing now and effectively rendering null and void, because these tariffs amount to such a systematic violation of its basic principles of free trade that the question is sort of what's left of that agreement. So I think there's a huge sector of the Trump administration, not at low levels, really at quite high levels, including the Commerce Secretary, who literally, as these tariffs were being announced, went on television to say these could be rolled back as soon as tomorrow. I think the timing is not a coincidence, coinciding as it did with the State of the Union address. But there's lots of time this week. That Trudeau call, I think, is a signal to me that we're approaching some kind of rolled back, not maybe all the way to zero, but these tariffs in their current state are obviously not sustainable. And I think that he's preparing the terrain to say there were concessions from these countries. You see, bullying works. And frankly speaking, he's on a win. He's on a high. One of the first things that Trump did, even before he took office, was to basically say, I'm going to retake the Panama Canal. It's become ridden with Chinese agents and Chinese influence. And just today, I believe, Panama announced the sale of the canal to BlackRock. Obviously an extension of U.S. American economic power on the world stage. This is a tremendous geopolitical victory and a point in his win column for bullying as a mode of U.S. American power. So there's a tension between how much hurt can the U.S. American economy handle, how much hurt will the Trumpian MAGA base tolerate, and then how sustainable is it for not the architecture of international trade, which of course has become completely paralyzed, completely transformed and discarded, not just by the Trump administration, but by the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, basically by all global northern countries that once swore to defend it at the level of the WTO. But just whether or not this is even something that should be considered, taken, the degree to which we should take it both literally and seriously is now in question. And I think for the Mexican part, in the conversations that I've had with Mexican officials, is to say, let's stay cool-headed, let's have this conversation, let's see if we can come to an agreement. And I wouldn't be surprised in that context if there are differential outcomes for Mexico and Canada that move at different speeds. This guy is so unilateral in the way that he thinks, he's so megalomaniacal in the way that he manages presidential affairs, that we may end up with this crazy archipelago of applied tariffs that correspond to his personal whims.
I hadn't heard about the Panama Canal stuff, just looking it up. So BlackRock have bought the ports on either side from a Hong Kong company. So not necessarily the canal itself, but I suppose, you control a canal by owning the ports on either side of it. So that kind of makes sense. That would be a win for Donald Trump if it's gone from a Hong Kong-owned or a Hong Kong-based company to BlackRock. Let's look at resistance to Trump within the United States. You mentioned the different strategies taken in Mexico and Canada. Within Washington, the Democrats have been struggling to work out quite how to mount a response to Trump's second presidency. His State of the Union address, or his not quite State of the Union address, was no exception. Throughout the speech, some Congress people held up signs reading false, essentially trying to fact-check Trump in real time. Other more radical members of the party bravely wore pink outfits to mark their objections to Trump's presidency. Some also walked out, with Democratic Congressman Maxwell Frost posting this. And we just walked out of the State of the Union. My shirt showed Trump an important message: no kings live here. In the spirit of the student protesters from the civil rights movement, I'm proud to have protested and walked out with many of my colleagues. This is not a normal time. Especially those first two scenes you could definitely describe as quite performative. There was one moment which was slightly more dramatic. This was Texan Congressman Al Green.
Members are directed to uphold and maintain decorum in the House and to cease any further disruptions. That's your warning. Finding that members continue to engage in willful and concerted disruption of proper decorum, the chair now directs the Sergeant-at-Arms to restore order. Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
Interrupting a speech is, of course, not exactly an unheard of or revolutionary form of protest, but senior congressional aides told CNN they couldn't recall another time a member of Congress was removed from the chamber, so at least it's somewhat unusual. Green has repeatedly criticized Trump over plans to cut federal health insurance, Medicaid, and he told reporters after the event he wanted to make clear that Trump had no mandate to cut Medicaid. David, the Democrats struggling to work out what to do. It is difficult to know what to do. What should they be doing?
Michael, this is a humiliation. This is a national disgrace. Of course, it's a national disgrace from these frat boy Republicans who are cheering, hey, 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 goodbye, and chanting USA. This is the most disgusting face of my country. But it's disgraceful from the Democratic Party. They were getting trumped up, sending out messages saying, we've got a plan for tonight. And they came in with these colored panels and little messages. One that went viral was one congresswoman that said, this is not normal. The mismatch between the claims that were issued from the highest echelons of the Democratic Party, that this person is a fascist, that this person is Hitlerian, this person represents the death of democracy in our great republic, and the decorum that they are expected to uphold and that they are committed to upholding. I think it requires a sort of sociological lens to understand why this class of politician is so deeply disconnected from the popular feeling, is so incapable of thinking through what resistance actually looks like. And I think, part of what's happening in the United States, part of what's happening in the Democratic Party is not too dissimilar to what has happened to the Labor Party and the PLP in recent years. Just a few days ago, I don't think we're touching on this later in the program, so I'll just go straight there. Just a few days ago, Politico came out with this big report that was obviously fed to them directly from this organization called, it's a third way organization called, I forget what it's called. It's one of these kind of, blue labor type of centrist Democrat organizations. And they had some big retreats where they brought the dons of the Democratic Party together. And the outcome of those discussions was to ban far left activists from spaces, to eliminate small dollar fundraising, to ignore the messages of grassroots movements and organizers who are issuing these radical calls to respond to social, economic, and racial justice demands. Their approach basically is to hunker down and say, we're going to follow our, rich donor thermometer. And for that class of Democrat, for that class of plutocrat, wearing a nice suit and going and frowning. That's the best that they can possibly imagine. This is a party that, frankly, it's difficult to imagine any mechanism through which these cretins could be evicted, through which a new crop of representatives could replace them, and through which the threat of this Trump administration, through that unprecedented acceleration of executive orders and its trifecta of governance that now basically promises to not just erode, but perhaps eliminate what remains of US Americans' basic constitutional rights. I mean, this is a disgrace. I cannot think of a US American voter beyond maybe 20, 30,000, suburban families plugged into their MSNBC brainwave machines who think it's courageous to take a selfie and with a frowning face and say, we disapprove of this administration. Democrats have come out with, one of these thick text tweets that says, look at all the things we're doing to resist the Trump administration. Half of those are lies. Half of those are overstatements. And none of them rise to the occasion of what this administration is actually doing. And I think that history will be, as unforgiving of the enablers like Lindsey Graham, who had lots of ideas about who were already on the wrong side of history and destined to arrive to the burning gates of hell, but, who basically curled away from any pre-existing principles to kowtow to Trump, but equally to this set of completely incompetent U.S. American Democratic Party representatives who were just caught with their pants down by this administration, even though they absolutely knew what was coming their way, and instead said, the problem isn't us, it's you, basically. And so I think that there is, from despair among the base of the Democratic Party, a certain sense of rage and desperation to find a new way of representing communities that are, frankly, under direct attack in the new Trump 2.0 administration.
Mm. It's quite possible that, he does terribly in the midterms and that somewhat changes the narrative. But again, that doesn't mean that the Republicans won't win the presidency in 4 years' time. With Trump's tariffs expected to hit global growth and a desire to spend more on the military, Rachel Reeves is struggling to meet her self-imposed fiscal rules. And the BBC report the Chancellor is planning to respond by cutting the welfare bill by billions. Health and disability benefits are believed to be in the line of fire. The total welfare bill for health-related benefits is currently 25% higher than it was before the COVID pandemic. It's forecast to continue increasing. The government currently spends £65 billion a year on health and disability benefits, and it's projected to rise to £100 billion by 2030. Past attempts to cut disability benefits have, of course, as you'll know, had disastrous consequences, leading to outright destitution among many of Britain's most vulnerable. It was down to Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood to defend the plans on Radio 4 this morning.
It is right that a Labour government strains every sinew to make sure that the support is available to prevent people from leaving the labour market, or if they have left the labour market, to help them get back into it. The welfare sector has been very clear that this has got to be a clear focus for our government. There's a moral case here for making sure that people who can work are able to work.
And
there's a practical point here as well, because our
course.
current situation is unsustainable. So on both of those measures, I think the welfare secretary is looking at the right area of policy, and she will be setting out, in a matter of weeks in the very near future.
It's a political and moral choice, isn't
forward.
it? It's a political and moral choice. The government spends over £1 trillion or billions and billions and billions. You've got to find some savings. You can look at lots of different budgets, and you think it's right morally and politically right now, current circumstances, to say if savings have to be found, the welfare budget is where Rachel Reeves should go.
We've seen a huge rise in that welfare budget. We know that there are millions of people who are out of work in our country who want to be in work. It is absolutely morally the right thing to do to support people, to make sure either they don't leave the labour market, or if they have, they're supported to get back into it.
So she's sort of switching the Labour Party between we don't want to do this, but we have to do it because we're short of money, to actually this is a good thing to do because we want to get people back to work. On the former argument, of course, when a government is short of cash, cutting spending isn't the only option. They could also raise taxes on the very rich. They could also borrow to invest. But I do think it makes sense when it comes to day-to-day spending to try and tax people to pay for that. one thing they can do is, as I say, tax the rich. That's not normally very popular among the very rich, though a group called Patriotic Millionaires are demanding just that. One of their number is Dale Vince, the founder and owner of green electricity company Ecotricity. I caught up with Dale earlier today and asked what he thought about Labour's plans to cut the welfare budget.
Well, I understand that global events have changed the economic outlook, and I think there's like 10 billion arguably missing to take into account. But I think that cutting welfare budgets, that's not the only option that we have. We have the option to have a wealth tax, actually, something we proposed before the last budget. Just 2% tax on wealth above £10 million will only affect 20,000 people, but would raise £24 billion a year. So we could fund that 10 billion gap and have a load more money to spend on the things that we desperately need in our country if we go about it in a different way.
I know you're part of an organisation called Patriotic Millionaires, who are sort of calling for increased wealth taxes. To what extent are you in a very small minority amongst Britain's wealthy, or do you see that sort of there are a growing number of very rich people who are more open to the idea that they should pay a bit more in tax?
If we are a minority, we're a minority within a minority, aren't we? Because people that are wealthy are a minority in our country. As I say, the £10 million and above threshold for a tiny, tiny tax will only affect 20,000 people. I think Patriotic Millionaires doesn't have 20,000 members, so you're probably right. We're a relative minority within that small group. But that doesn't matter to me. You know, it's about fairness in our tax system. We have a £10 billion problem to solve. We shouldn't place that burden on the people in our country that have the least.
I don't want you to necessarily reveal all of your financial affairs. I'll just say I've looked on Wikipedia. Wikipedia says you're worth £107 million. I don't know how accurate that is. But that would mean that you would be, according to your proposals, paying about £2 million extra to the state in the form of an annual wealth tax. Is that correct? And how would that work?
I have no idea. I never even considered it or looked at it. I just think it's the right thing in principle. There's a lot of talk about what I'm worth, and there has been since around about, 2008, I think, when the Sunday Times put me on their rich list. And they did it on the basis that Ecotricity, the company I founded and owned, they said was worth 100 million quid. So it sounds like it's gone up a little bit, according to Wiki. It's a paper fortune. So, there's not a lot of complexity about my affairs. I've got one bank account. I've got no offshore investments of any kind. And just this group of companies that I've built, which people say is worth, this, that, or the other. So it's a paper fortune. But it is what it is. I think that our tax system is unfair. We tax money made with a pair of hands, a job, at a far higher rate than we tax money made with money itself. We have capital gain tax for that, which is now 24%. It went up from 20 in the last budget. Whereas if you're paying income tax in total with national insurance and everything, you're paying nearly 50% of your income. And I think that disparity needs addressing, even in a tiny way, with this 2% wealth tax would be a good start.
I wasn't trying to do a gotcha with your net worth. I suppose what I'm interested in is how a wealth tax would work, because you said it's your paper wealth. But then is that what we'd be taxing? Would we be taxing your what you've called your paper wealth? I mean, what would it be? Would it be the Treasury sort of saying we think Dale's worth this much money, and therefore he owes us 2% of that?
Like I said, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I support the idea in principle. I hadn't thought about how it would affect me or be applied to me. And honestly, I don't care, because it would be a great thing to do.
I respect that. That's a strong political position. People say, and I suppose Labour at the moment, they're terrified that growth isn't going to come about. They're worried about frightening the horses when it comes to wealthy people who they think will disproportionately invest in the country. They think they'll go over to tax havens. I mean, obviously a lot of them already have. Should they be worried about that? Should they be worried that if they introduce a wealth tax, then Britain's entrepreneurs will flee?
Well, I don't think so, because it's a really small sum of money. We're talking about 2% on, a considerable sum of money, 10 million or more. I think it's the kind of sum that people won't miss. I think also there's a moral issue here. We shouldn't be afraid to apply tax fairly to people just in case they flee the country. I also think that it's an overdone issue. overdone by the right-wing media. We saw after the last budget a lot of talk that millionaires would leave because of the rise in capital gains tax and some other loophole closing. And in the end, something like 0.3 or 0.03% of British millionaires had left the country. It's a tiny number of people. And I think if they don't want to pay their fair share, they should leave, and we'll be better off without them.
I want to talk more generally about the Labour government and what you think of their sort of performance so far. You campaigned for them before the general election. You're obviously in a key industry for the Labour Party. They really want to get, green industries growing. They want to radically shift electricity production to be nearly all renewable by 2030. Do you see them as on track to do that?
Actually, you reminded me of something I wanted to say about growth. In your previous question, you talked about that. News from the CBI last week was that the green economy in Britain grew by 10% last year, and it added £83 billion to our economy. It's a vast sum of money. Our entire defence spending is £57 billion. And so we can have growth and we can have more fair tax. And we don't need to worry about a few people that might up sticks because they have to pay a little bit more. Are Labour on course? I think in terms of green electricity, it's an ambitious target to get to 100% by 2030, but I don't think it really matters if we only get to 90% because we'll have come a very long way. We're at about 50% now, and I think it's a really important thing. And that's a vital part of the green economy that's adding so much value to our economy every day.
You said 90% would be impressive as well. I mean, I think most people would probably agree with that. What have you sort of made, though, of their specific policies? There's money for carbon capture and storage, isn't there? They're trying to make it easier to build inland wind farms and also pylons above the ground. So where do you think this Labour government has made a difference, and where should they go further?
I think the really good things, they're fast out the gates with an unbanning of onshore wind. That happened within, I think, 70 hours or something like that. The unblocking of some major solar projects the Tories have been holding up. That was all good stuff. The target itself of 100% by 2030 is a brilliant thing to do. The easier consenting process for pylons, as you say, that's a vital part of building more generating infrastructure. All of that stuff is good. Where I think I disagree with the government is the commitment to carbon capture and storage. It's an uneconomic concept. It's been in the world for 40 years and it still doesn't work anywhere in the world at scale commercially. And it's really not part of our zero carbon future. I can't see that. It's something for the oil companies to obsess about because it gives them a business as usual pathway. I'm also against the investment in Sizewell C. I think Hinkley, we're well underway. We should finish the job. It might take another 10 years. It's well over budget, time and money-wise. Nuclear power always is, but I don't think we should do Sizewell C. And that's probably it, really. There's good and bad in there, I would say.
And anything, I suppose, that they're not doing? Is there anything sort of that you think could really transform Britain's sort of green energy system, making it sort of cheaper and more abundant, that sort of they're not doing? Is there some sort of low-hanging fruit that you're sort of telling Ed Miliband, you should do this, you're missing a trick here?
There is, actually. You reminded me. It's green gas made from grass. So we've talked, we normally just talk about electricity, the 2030 target, all that kind of stuff. But gas is a big part of our energy mix in the country right now, and particularly used for heating our homes is a major contributor to our emissions and what's known as decarbonizing home heating, I think is the biggest, most difficult problem we have to solve to get to net zero. And we've got a legacy from the Johnson era government of a national heat pump program, which is absolutely bonkers. When in fact, rather than scrap the gas grid and throw away tens of millions of boilers, all we have to do is change the gas in the grid to be gas made from grass. It's a massive economic opportunity, 160,000 jobs created in the rural economy, which helps give a transition for farmers, enormous areas of land turned over to wildlife havens and that kind of stuff. And we can make carbon neutral gas here in Britain, priced here in Britain, independent of global fossil fuel markets. Mad economic opportunity, probably the biggest one in the green economy of all of them.
Interesting. Other guests we've had have been very enthusiastic about sort of transforming our heating systems to heat pumps. I have to say, I'll have to look into this making gas from grass. I'm not read up enough to challenge you on that one. Let's move on to a very different topic, though, which is you recently took Guido Fawkes to court for, I think, sort of implying you were a Hamas supporter. You've come to an out-of-court settlement. Could you talk about that?
He didn't imply it. He outright stated I was, some sympathizer with baby murdering, terrorists, like all kinds of graphic language. And it was based on a doctored interview that I did at the Labour conference 18 months ago, actually. And off the back of that, there was a pylon, right-wing pylon by the Daily Mail, GB News, one Lord, 3 Tory MPs, Richard Tice. I mean, it's a long list of people. And I sued them all. The current score is 7-0. I sued the Daily Mail successfully for the second time last week because they repeated the libel. And there are 2 left standing, Richard Tice and Lord Bailey. But in the case of Guido Fawkes, the originator of the whole deceit, he did settle out of court after the judge had ruled at a preliminary hearing that he basically had no defense. And so he accepted an offer that we made 9 months ago for £10,000 in damages. And he's now facing legal costs of probably £150,000 on top of that. It was a foolish thing. He thought he was immune from British law. He'd boasted about it online before. And he chose to defend this claim because we went after his internet service provider in terms of the offending material using a law that the Premier League uses, a media law. He chose to defend it. He's lost it. And we've punctured the bubble of immunity from the things that are said on the Guido Fawkes website. I think that's a really big victory for freedom of people from abuse from the media.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer's pledge to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP is supposed to make us safer. The more ready we are to go to war, the argument goes, the less likely we'll be attacked. But on Good Morning Britain, James Schneider challenged that logic.
It's not just a question of if you spend money, it will make us more secure. Let's look at the track record of British military policy over the last 35 years. We invaded Afghanistan, the Taliban are back in charge. We invaded Iraq, that created ISIS, made us less safe at home. We backed the overthrow of Gaddafi, causing wreckage to the whole region. We spend tens of billions of pounds on Trident. The missiles are not even ours. We have to lease them from the US.
And
there hasn't been a successful test launch in over a decade. So
but we're about to celebrate, after 80 years, VE Day with parties' processions. Because 80 years ago, we, with our partners, fought off a fascist threat to the East through our military power. I mean, isn't that something to learn from?
Well, my point is this blank check that we are writing, 2% to 2.5% to 2.6% to 3% of GDP, this blank check, is it going to make us any safer? Did Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, make us any safer?
It does seem like quite a strange, I suppose, rhetorical tactic from Ed Balls. So you've got James Schneider there saying, look, spending money on the military doesn't necessarily equal security. I mean, obviously for security, you've probably got to spend some money on the military. But there isn't a sort of one-to-one relationship. And the examples given are lots of recent military expeditions, which the UK has gone on, that have made us less safe, not more safe. And then Ed Balls says, but what about something 80 years ago? Right? The last war that we fought that everyone sort of recognises was a good war to fight. Just forget about all those wars in the meantime. Ed Balls didn't want to speak about Iraq or Afghanistan, though. He wanted to go back to the Nazis instead.
But I'm asking about Germany. I'm asking about Germany in the Second World War and a threat in Europe to our east. Is that so different from the threat to our east from Putin today?
I do think that Nazi Germany and contemporary Russia are really rather different.
Right.
I mean,
so defend Putin then. No,
I'm sorry. Just because you don't think that someone is the same as Hitler doesn't mean that they should be defended. Vladimir Putin is a reaction.
Has invaded another country, and he's a dictator.
Vladimir Putin is a very nasty, reactionary, conservative leader who's been in power for 25 years, who invaded another country. Okay. That should be opposed, absolutely. So, for example, I think that where Britain does put money into Ukraine, it should be on securing the peace deal. So I wouldn't want us to send arms which could be used to extend that war. But I do think a commitment to peacekeepers is a very sensible
thing. So you would have British troops on the ground in Ukraine?
As peacekeepers, as part of a peace agreement.
Such a bizarre, I suppose, is it a bizarre interviewing style, or is it an interviewing style that sort of gets fused because you're intentionally trying to rile up your interviewee? David, if you won't call Putin Hitler, you're defending Putin. It is the kind of, it's funny because it's ridiculous, but it is also the kind of journalism that is quite worrying, actually, in times of, war and peace. You'll remember sort of the same narrative being used about Saddam Hussein before the Iraq War. I had the historian Richard Evans on last Friday, who was talking about how Nasser was compared to Hitler before the Suez Crisis, when we tried to take back the Suez Canal by military force, when he was an Arab nationalist who was actually bringing about some pretty impressive development in his country. What did you make of that exchange? I know James Schneider is a colleague of yours.
Yeah, I should probably recuse myself from the segment, but I would reinforce his point. I mean, I would have responded to the last point about an invasion by reiterating that the United States and the United Kingdom invaded another sovereign country, Iraq. I mean, as well as raining bombs and initiating regime change in Libya and leading many other such regime change operations. I mean, if Ed Balls is not prepared to call George W. Bush, for example, paint him with the same brush as Hitlerian in that way, and be prepared to fight him on that terrain, then I think we are in another kind of conceptual universe than the one he'd like us to live in, which is to think about Ukraine as a purifying, holy, spiritual war of good versus evil, in the ways that I know from my many years living on your cursed island, many yearn for that Manichaean universe from 80 years ago. But there's a deeper point that I would make, which I'm sure James, as the comms guru he is, would have made elsewhere in the argument about rearming Europe, as Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission, has made, and as Keir Starmer has also made, which is that there is a false equivalence. There's a false comparison that's being made between the two sides of the Atlantic, or the two major partners in NATO, the United States and the UK and Europe. The idea being that there is always extra cash. There's always a bucket of money for defense. When US Americans, as we like to do, say that a bomb being sent to Israel is a school that's not being built in Kentucky, there is a certain degree at a level there of truth. But the reality is, and we need to be honest about this, that the fiscal and monetary privileges that have been endowed to the United States through the international systems of trade and finance, through the global supremacy of the dollar, mean that trade-off is not so biting. It's not so real. It is not actually the case that a bomb being produced and paid for by the United States means that we're stripping funding elsewhere in the US social or welfare state, which is only to say that every time we do slash those budgets, it is out of a sense of cruelty, not necessity. And that relates back to the earlier point about the Labour Party's present pursuit of welfare budget cuts, and how fascinating it is that all roads, social democratic and hard right reactionary, seem to lead to one inevitable outcome, which is hitting the poorest hardest. However, it is the case that in Europe, when Ursula von der Leyen says, all of a sudden, we've found this big bucket of money to rearm Europe, that there is a zero-sum logic at play in Europe's security strategy. That is to say, the European Union has not found new money because there is no new money to find. Similar to the Green Deal, for example, which was supposed to be its landmark man-on-the-moon mission to drive Europe's green transition, the plan to rearm Europe is a reshuffling of money. Every euro that is taken to buy a bomb from a US-American defense contractor is a euro that is taken out of the pension of a retired family in Andalusia or in Thessaloniki or in Warsaw, right? It is simply the case that in this constrained fiscal environment of the Eurozone in particular, and you could make the case in the UK, although I don't want to get into an argument about monetary theories, that there is more of a zero-sum logic at play there. And I think that's really where we have to be fighting this fight. James is right to ask the basic question of whether these plans to increase defense budgets do indeed make us safer. And my expectation is that advancing a politics of anti-militarism and peace, as we do from our Progressive International, is to represent not even a silent majority, but a significant and quite vocal majority across the most of Europe. I do not think it is the case that a community in Porto, Portugal, or in Barcelona, Spain, or in Bordeaux, France, feels that there is an imminent risk tomorrow that Putin will arrive on their doorstep. And they should be asking the hard question, is this increase in our budget for defense, which shouldn't be called defense, for buying weapons, going to make us safe And what does safety mean? I mean, we enter into a really fascinating and philosophical terrain about positive and negative freedoms, because it is the case that whatever negative freedom that is supposedly, and James is right to even question the veracity of this, will make that family safer for some hypothetical invasion that is in no way perceived by any true expert of defense to be imminent on the continent of Europe, right? It is right to ask at what cost that will come, because it will impoverish the people of Europe, and it will be deployed. Those weapons will be deployed, if not in Moscow, then in Kabul, or indeed on the South Pacific, somewhere else. Because the only way to make that warfare economy work is to keep buying, to keep producing, to keep making these weapons. So it's not the case that you just buy a bunch of bombs and then keep them in storage. If you want to run a warfare economy, which is what the Europe is preparing to do, great FT article from its least distinguished opinion writer saying that if Europe wants to make a warfare state, it has to trim away its welfare state. To keep that warfare state running, you have to keep buying stuff. You have to keep producing weapons, and to keep producing weapons to justify it, you start to have to dropping bombs. You have to start using those weapons, and that's, I think, what James is articulating. The self-fulfilling prophecy of these defense budget raises this defense expenditure, because it creates this not just a bellicose logic, but a certain August 1914 craze to say, well, if we're going to be at war, we're going to be at war. And I think it's critical and incumbent upon us, especially our generation, to try to be clear-minded and cool-headed about what the present geopolitical juncture is, what kind of threats a country like Great Britain, and I would argue no one gives enough of a fuck about Great Britain to invade it right now. And I'll eat my book, in the words of Matt Goodwin, if I'm wrong about this, to justify this massive increase in defense expenditure, when it will inevitably and indeed come at the cost of people's lives and livelihoods across the country.
If we do get invaded, I will pause before running to my makeshift bomb shelter to demand you eat a book. David Adler, let's wrap up there. Are you going to be playing computer games this evening? Lots of people noticing you're in a gaming chair. It's quite a chic background other than that.
Yeah. Oh God, no, I don't do that. I should really clean my reputation immediately. No, I'm not. But it comes with the absence of disclosure of location. Thank you for having me, Michael, and I promise to move back to a more normal chair for next time.
What a relief. A nice background other than that. Thank you for watching. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.